I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to come here and share my experiences with this illustrious group of presenters who have such interesting stories. I have to say that when I was asked, I didn't hesitate to say yes, because I thought that would give me an opportunity to step back and look at what has been happening to policy choices. I ignored the plus 24 hours flight to come here. So if during the presentation you see me yawning, it's not because of lack of interest, but just that the body is sending me messages. I also want to thank Ted and Kate. I want to thank Ted and Kate for the opportunity of listening. I think this is the first time you're making the presentation on the outcome of your work. And for me, it's very, very illuminating, because one of the things that we've been looking at is the possibility of alternative delivery mechanisms for social services. Those of you who follow the development debate know that one of the arguments that Paul Collier is advancing is that, because these public institutions, particularly the civil service, the health workers, etc., are so inept, we should consider unorthodox ways. Well, this may not necessarily be the obvious solution if one goes by what we've just heard. When we talk about post-conflict countries, or if you've followed, and some of you have followed the pattern in post-conflict countries, immediately after the accord is signed, there is very limited space for policy choices to be made, and this is. And I will explain later, you will see later why. But this also means that the policy decisions that are taken are not usually supported by the latest research or evidence-based observations. This is because there is this rush. There's a rush to return everything to normalcy. I believe that the eyes move faster than the mouth speaks. So the silence is there to allow you to read. While what I'm talking about applies primarily to Sierra Leone, I had the opportunity also of serving in the DRC as humanitarian coordinator of the UN. And I see quite a lot of parallels between what happened immediately after the conflict and the succeeding early years of post-conflict. So some of these conclusions or observations apply equally to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So we're going to look at the underlying rationale for some of the choices and decisions that were taken, the choices made, decisions taken after the conflict. One of the points I want to make is that when we talk about a continuum after the transition from conflict to normalcy, we must realize that the space, that the environment changes as the years from the war recede. So what happens is that immediately after the war, there is really little opportunity, very limited opportunity for policy changes. Decisions are the results of all kinds of compromises and also all kinds of pressures. But as quote-unquote normalcy appears on the scene, there is much more, a much greater opportunity for one to look at evidence-based research and observations. Our hope is really to find a different trajectory for Sierra Leone. I should also thank Ted and Kate for giving you some of the gruesome data on Sierra Leone's performance before the conflict. There was some glitch in transferring graphs, so you wouldn't find too many graphs. Is this one? Okay, so the problems appear during the peace negotiations. What happens is, now, as you know, during the peace negotiations, you have all kinds of forces. You have the internal and you have the international. The international have different agendas, never the same agenda. The agenda for the multilateral institutions differ from the agenda from the bilaterals. So somehow you have to prepare a soup of all of these agendas and come up with something. And that something is what the government that takes over has to work with. I have listed here some of the factors that come into play, and that these factors produce unintended consequences. Usually, and in the case of Sierra Leone, but also in the case of DRC, the local power, the sub-regional power brokers all have their own candidates that they support. So during the negotiations, you have to come up with some kind of a compromise. And finally, what happens may not necessarily be what if the country had an opportunity, what the country would have chosen. In addition, you also had at this particular juncture a lot of the skilled people, the expertise would have left, not just because of the conflict, but because of the declining economic situation that occurred about 2 decades before. This was the case of the DRC, and similarly was the case in Sierra Leone. Unfortunately, I can't show you those graphs, but the decline in Sierra Leone started almost immediately after independence. So, but somehow, public policy research and studies have never pointed to this decline. But rather what happened is that every year people keep pointing to the old and better years without realizing that every year things were going bad. And instead of going up after independence, we went down. There's also international pressures. In Sierra Leone, at its height, we had approximately 18,000 peacekeepers, costing over $500 million per annum. Now, the donor community didn't want to support that, so immediately the guns fell silent. There was the push to get the peacekeepers out, return to normalcy. And again, sometimes because we do not have indigenously developed policy options, we inevitably, or those who are in decision making at that time, inevitably accept whatever comes in, and this depends on who is paying. And so you have all kinds of interestingly, but experimental proposals which are really soft options to deal with major problems. For example, we have, and I was mentioning, we have what is called the PPRC, the Political Party Registration Committee, that is supposed to deal with mainly political violence and other disagreements among parties. Now, I researched the other day, and I couldn't find an advanced country that has something like that. Yet this was forced down on us because it was felt to be the solution, a soft option. But what happens is that it weakens the normal mechanisms that would exist in any democratic country to resolve issues, meaning the court system, the judiciary. I think this is very important. When you talk about public policy, you have a system in place here in the US, in the UK, and so on. You have a democratic system in place through which that policy is processed. Now, didn't exist in DRC, doesn't exist in Sierra Leone, because right from the word go, those institutions were eroded, and over time they became paper tigers, as the Maoists would say. So, policy is largely influenced by who makes the decision. And I want to use the national budget preparation as a case in point. If you were to ask our colleagues from the IMF, who have spent a lot of money and a lot of time and also the World Bank in building up budget processes. They will tell you that we have a fantastic system on paper. But the reality is, for some of the reasons I pointed out earlier, it really doesn't work. What happens, you do have budget hearings, but the decision is made by the Ministry of Finance. From there, it goes to cabinet. By the time it gets to cabinet, there are discussions, but there's no change, because by that time it's a zero-sum game. And if you take from health to give to education, health is not going to be happy. So, that's it. It goes to parliament. By the time it gets to parliament, it's what you have here. You have the ruling party and the opposition. So the ruling party has come up with something, the opposition will oppose it, whether it's good or not, and at the end of the day, there's a vote. So we looked at how many changes, how many budgets have experienced change since 2002, and we found only 2 cases. It's also interesting to point out what happens after the conflict. During the war, you have a lot of humanitarian aid, humanitarian activities by donors, NGOs, and so on. They get their monies from the existence of a crisis. End crisis, they have no further reason to be there. Even within the donor, within a single country, the source of money changes. I understand the head of USAID is here, and I think they have different ports. So they can operate only at a certain point, and before that point, there's another group that is responsible. So you have an evolution. Immediately after the conflict, you will have what I call a mini boom, because you have a lot of food aid, humanitarian assistance, and so on, and these are the people that are taking care of providing a social safety net. And then you have a boom that is caused by the fact that you have 18,000 troops there, and who are spending money. And you also have a lot of NGOs that would have recruited the best and the brightest that remain behind and are receiving reasonable salaries. So everybody is happy. And then end crisis, and there's the exodus. And the new government is faced not with a boom, but a slump. And immediately everybody begins to think it's the fault of the government. Now, if you look, and I didn't do a sufficiently rigorous assessment, but going back to the first presentation where the lady spoke about crisis elections and so on, you would see that almost inevitably after a crisis, there is a change of government. After the first government is elected. If there is no change, there's a huge debate. And trust me, almost in all these cases, you have electoral fraud. It's a question of how well you manage it to remain in power. But otherwise, if the people had their say, almost all of these governments would be changed after the first elections. And it's not necessarily only because these governments are inept, but because of where they found themselves. You come into government, everything seems to be doing well, so people with high expectations, they expect things to go up. What happens is, completely outside the government, you have these exodus. Now, so when that government comes in, decisions, faced with that, the government doesn't have time to really reflect, doesn't have the capacity, and they tend to give priority to short-term solutions. And in the end, this is what determines decision-making in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, the first couple of years. As I say, it changes as time goes by. I will illustrate by giving you 3. I think I ended up by only showing 2. Illustrating my arguments with two cases. The timing of the general elections. I was going to talk about rehabilitation of mining sector. If we have time, I'll do that. But more important is the business of relaunching rather than recreating the economy. In the DRC, in presentations I made everywhere, I used to say to, whenever I had the opportunity or there people listen to me, please, 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 do not recreate Zaire. Build a new Congo. So let's take the timing of the general elections. And this is where I wonder about policy research. Although increasingly I've started seeing some writings questioning the wisdom of immediately going into elections after the conflict. But the conventional wisdom is that get a legitimate government. First thing to do, get a legitimate government, move on, and get elections. And again, as I mentioned, these are the factors that push for this. Now, there are some consequences, unintended consequences of going into immediate elections. Usually the parties that were there before the conflict and the political parties, they are the ones that have the mechanisms, the reach, the structure to continue immediately. New parties based on new ideologies or different bases do not have sufficient time to do that. So what happens is that we recreate the old political system. And we return to old-style politics. In 2002, there's a landslide victory for one of the parties. We also have two major parties. That is called SLPP. But that was more a vote for peace than for good governance. There was not enough time for NGOs and others to talk to the people, and you can see this is something that will take time because of 5 decades of one form of behavior. It's not surprising that you couldn't have the change that you are looking for at the community level, nor could you have it at a national level within a year or two. So the new government, remember, this is what they are faced with. I mean, it's just a recipe for failure. It is in the middle of that we are told, relaunch the economy. But what you're relaunching is what led to the conflict in the first place. But relaunching was easy because the solutions were already what were the known solutions and not the new solutions that policy could have brought about. Okay. So this relaunch the economy inadvertently reintroduced almost all the weaknesses that existed before the conflict. And it's only after the first 5 years that you find the policy space to begin to change some of those. Yeah. This is what one should be looking for immediately after the conflict. But immediately after the conflict, what do? Let's relaunch the mines, because then we can get employment. Okay. These are the characteristics of what would have been the new economy that should have been the target immediately after the conflict. Okay. Now, the way forward. We are faced with a very serious threat. And the graphs didn't show up, but we have arguably the largest reserve of iron ore in the world now. They are estimated 45 billion tons. We have huge deposits of gold, newly discovered. Rutile, we are still the third largest source of rutile in the world. And there are promising signs from petroleum. But this also is a likely threat, poses the likely threat of a natural resource curse, unless policy-based options are provided to the government. Why do we have hope that this is going to happen? We recently launched a conference on development and transformation that was completely independent. The government appointed, I was asked to lead it, and had a completely free hand. So we brought in specialists and we looked at how to rethink the development process in order to find a new strategy that challenges many of the orthodoxies. And because it was launched by the president and this is elections here, he has already given his support for it, and some of the recommendations are already being implemented. If we go through with that, we will avoid the resource curse. If we don't, then within the next 12 to 18 months, we will have set the foundation for a return to conflict. I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Hi. Yeah, to the first group, I was really inspired by the degree to which you prioritized academic integrity in your research. That was really, really, really wonderful to see. I was curious, to what extent did you seek to incorporate any social psychologists in trying to understand why there wasn't the kind of institutional change you would hope to see, or similar fields?
So we had a lot of perspectives in trying to design those structured community activities. We did a lot of qualitative work and quantitative work. We mixed a lot of disciplinary perspectives. The problem is, in terms of unpacking why it didn't work, I mean, the framework of our research, unfortunately, was kind of an all or nothing, right? So we don't have villages that had different levels of exposure to facilitation or different amounts of money. So, I mean, we can speculate about why we think it didn't work, but we didn't have a complex enough design to untangle what were the factors that were responsible for really pushing, more voice of women and youth. It's difficult to unpack.
You mentioned the dangers of trying to go back to normalcy too quickly and holding elections too quickly. But if the country tries to take time, then what would happen between the power gap, and wouldn't the vacancy of power lead to more confusion and maybe even heighten the probability of going into another conflict after the conflict?
Yeah, actually, I think that 3 to 5 years, in my view, 3 to 5 years should be the space allowed for civil society, donors, everyone under the sun to educate the people a lot more about the governance system that we're going to adopt, so that people understand the responsibilities of parliamentarians. What has happened even in the second elections, now that we're going into the third elections, there are reports that many communities are saying, we don't want these parliamentarians, we never saw them. Now, if the education system had occurred during that interregnum, you would be able to avoid some of these. And I believe that even if we were still stuck with the same parties, that the level of accountability and responsiveness to what the people want would be quite different from what it is now. As it is, we merely repeated the same political system that existed.
Yeah, hi. This question is for Kate and Ted. Given that the survey was implemented, pretty quickly after the Civil War ended, I was sort of surprised to see that we didn't have any measures for the exposure to violence, between the communities. So I was wondering if you guys stratified on that, and if so, if the treatment effect varied in terms of communities that did experience lots of violence and communities that really didn't see much violence at all.
Yeah, so we collected a lot of data on exposure to violence. We just didn't sort of present it here. And it's been the focus of some of our other work. It's been trying to understand how exposure to violence affected local collective action and local politics. So it's been one of the big focuses of our overall research project. In the pre-analysis plan, we actually wrote in, as part of our ex-ante plan, to look for differential effects by communities' violence experience, because we thought that could be a very salient dimension of difference. And it turns out, when you compare the treatment communities that got CDD who experienced a lot of violence with those that didn't, and sort of with the equivalent comparison in the control group, you don't see any differential effects. So, one story might have been in the communities affected by violence, institutions were really destroyed, and GoBIFO, this CDD program, helped build them back up. But we don't find any increased activity in terms of collective action or women's involvement, even in those communities. And that was something that was written into the pre-analysis plan that we looked at. So it was certainly on our minds. We were also interested in things like whether communities with more or less education had differential effects, or communities with different histories and other dimensions. We could talk about it afterwards. But we didn't find significant differences. It was a zero effect across all these different types of communities. And that was one of the striking findings, is that zero impact on the functioning of local government was a very general finding.
Thanks for presenting such excellent findings of your research. I was just curious as to how community organized processes like you researched, how that could, in the long run, actually help change the institutions. It's been seen that institutions from a higher decision point of view takes a longer time to evolve and provide the kind of development activities at the lower rungs of the ladder. And it seems that from the other end, the community-driven projects are actually having impact, right? So is there a possibility in the future that these two forces could shape up so that both the people at the lower rung of the ladder are empowered to make change, and the government is also more aware that these things are needed? So development in these kind of countries speed up than now. Thank you.
So one thing we didn't mention in terms of the background is that at this village level project was actually housed within the decentralization secretariat of the government. So at the same time, there was a massive political reform to reinstate local level government. Ted mentioned that Shaka Stevens had abolished local level government, so that they were reinstated around the same time that this pilot project was implemented. And it was explicitly designed to pair this kind of decentralization from Freetown to the districts down to what's called a ward with this bottom-up pressure linking the villages to the ward. And the same project also operated on the ward level. And some of the things we didn't report was we actually do see it was quite successful in creating links between the villages and their most local level political representatives. So we actually see that these hardware effects, these new schools and things, they had much more input in the planning and the oversight from the elected government than in the control areas who had similar infrastructure. We find that so there's a big impact in engagement with local government and also engagement with the traditional authorities. So it seems like there was some potential for these things to be mutually beneficial and build upon each other, but it wasn't this spark that had a kind of opened the floodgates for a big social movement.
Let me just add that the conference I was telling you about, after in which we had like 200 focus group discussions around the country, district level town hall meetings, our conclusion was that change is only going to happen if you empower the people to lead the leaders. It may sound as a contradiction in terms, but after 50 years in which the leaders led the people to destruction, we are saying and we are seeing that where the people express very clear positions, irrespective of political divide, on certain issues, the government responds. This has been the case, for example, with a very, very badly negotiated mining agreement where there was a hue and cry by the civil society that forced the government to insist on immediate renegotiation, and similarly so to look at the way in which the mining sector was restructured. So I do believe that, and perhaps I may be stepping out of turn here, but I think with the people taking back power, as you seem to want to do in this Occupy Wall Street, the leaders will listen.
Thank you.